welcome to another episode of Wired In with Appavelli. I missed last week, been really busy working on some projects, working on some apps, so I missed a week. Sometimes that might happen depending how lost I get or wired in to a project. So I decided to do a tutorial or podcast tutorial, and I want to talk about methods in C#. So let's get wired in. So first, what is a method? So a method or function in other languages, function in JavaScript is called a function. In C++ is called the function. In Java and C#, you will hear the term method, but some programmers will still say function. Doesn't really matter. The words basically mean the same thing interchangeably, but we'll go with method. That's what Microsoft calls it, and so we'll call it a method. So a method is basically a block of code that has a series of statements. So let's get right to it. You have two different types of methods. You have a static method and you have a non-static method. So a static method is basically a method that can't be instantiated. It's a class method, so it belongs to the class. And a non-static method is a method that has to be instantiated. So we're going to look at that by first looking at here is the first method we're going to execute. And I just simply called it return int. So all it's doing is going to return an int. So here you have to declare the static keyword if you want this to be a static method, and the return type. Now this can be an integer, a double, a string, a class, whatever you want to return. And then you simply give it a name. And generally when you name a method in C#, you're going to use this naming convention where it starts with in capital. So here, return, I'm going to start with a capital R, and then int, start with a capital I for short for integer. So here is the method. It's a block of code. So you declare the name, and you have to declare two brackets or braces. And then here you write your code. So here we simply just want to return an int. So what I did here is declare an int, x equal to 5. And we're just going to print out x. And anytime you have a return type in any method, whether it's static or non-static, when you specify the return type, you have to return that type. So since this is a return type int, you have to return an int. If you don't have a return type, this is what will happen. You'll get an error. See, you're going to get an error. Program return type, not all code paths return a value. So you have to return the value. Now, if you change this to void, you don't have to return the value. But here, return X. Yeah, I was working on some other code. So let's go ahead and execute our first method. So here's our main method, right? So also, before I go on, when I do other tutorials, I'm probably going to do everything in the form of a method. It's easier to read that way instead of just writing everything in the main method. Now notice the main method is static. So since this is a static method, all I have to do is just type return int. And of course, typo. Return int. See how much clean this is? That's really what the main method is for. Once you start typing classes, you can call everything in the main. It's a lot neater instead of just typing all this code. So let's, for example, if we took all this code that we typed in our methods and put it into the main, it would be a mess. So let's go ahead and start without debugging, and it should just print out 5. Yep, prints 5. So that we can comment. All right, let's go to the next static method. Now this we're going to return a double, and in this static method we're simply just going to calculate the unemployment rate. So now you can pass arguments and methods. So this has a return type of double, so it returns double. But here we're passing 2 doubles in the parameters. The first is labor force and number unemployed, or num unemployed. That's with the variable. And here we're just going to return the labor force divided by num unemployed. So when you call this in the main, or if you call this in other classes, once we talk about classes later on, since this is passing parameters, you have to always pass 2 parameters. So let's go ahead and execute that method. Unemployment rate. Now watch, you're going to get an error here. Unemployment rate. Let's see what it says. There is no argument given that corresponds to the required formal parameter labor force of program dot unemployment rate double, etc., and num unemployed. So all we have to do, you don't have to declare any new variables. If you want, you can declare 2 doubles here and pass the parameters, but here we're going to simply just pass 2 doubles. So we're going to do 4.0. My keyboard is not cooperating. This is live coding here, so let's go ahead and fix. Right, so sorry about that. All right, now 4.0. We're going to pass that parameter, and then we're going to do, I don't know why my decimal, I got to be careful. I need to get a new keyboard because this keyboard is not cooperating. So I would just do 444. So when we execute this, so let's go ahead and comment this out again. Focus on unemployment rate. So we passed 2 doubles. You know what? 0.0. So now let's see what the unemployment rate is. Now these are just made up numbers. It doesn't print anything. You know why it's not printing anything? Because I'm not printing to the console. Let's try this. Let's see if this works. We're going to cut and paste this. Will this work? Let's see. There. So the unemployment rate is 0.009 and a bunch of other numbers. So let me explain what I just did here. In this method, I'm basically just returning labor force divided by unemployment rate, right? That's all this is doing. This is simply just performing a calculation. So when I call this method here in the main, it passes the two arguments, but it's not printing anything in the method. So in order to print that in the console, I simply have to just console.writeLine and pass unemployment rate method with the two arguments. That's why I didn't get anything when I first executed the program. So now let's go to non-static methods. So we have a method. This is similar to what we did in the second episode with strings. So we're going to have a method rows and columns. So it's going to be 2 rows, 3 columns, and it's just going to print out stars. That's all this method is going to do, is just print out stars. So let's go through the method, the block of code. So first, this is void. So that means it doesn't return anything. This is just going to print out whatever's in this block of method. Whatever's in this method is what it's going to print out. So here we declare 6 strings. Each is going to have a star or asterisk. Then I'm going to create a string row 1. Set that equal to S1, S2, S3. You see the code here. And we're going to console.writeLine. We're going to print rows and columns variable. So when I call this in the main, all we need to do is print it. But since this is not a static method, we can't just call this in the main. So for non-static methods, you have to instantiate the class in order to call that method. So if you look, our class is called program. So this is what we have to do. We have to create an instance of program. And this is how we do that. Program. We're just going to keep it simple. Equals new program. So when we get into classes, this is how you instantiate a class. We'll go more into that when we talk about classes, but simply here, I'm calling the class program. I'm going to create the variable object program. This is an object. And then I'm going to assign the new keyword and instantiate a new program. So this is how you're going to access the non-static method. So you simply program dot, and then you're going to get a list and rows and columns. So this is how you access the non-static method. It's a lot different than what we did earlier with return int. All you have to do is return int because this is a class method, and this class is it's a class method, and the main method is static. So you don't have to, static methods cannot be instantiated. So here, program, this is the class, our class program. And let's say if this was a separate file, you would be able to do the same thing. But when we go over classes, we'll go more into detail. Simply, I use my program object, and then I call the method rows and columns. So let's execute. And it prints 2 rows, 3 columns. of asterisks, stars, whatever you want to call it. Now for the last, we're actually going to do some user input. So the last non-static method, I call it get input. So here we have string input because we're returning a string. So string input equals console.readLine. And if you remember from the second tutorial podcast, you have to declare this to read user input from the console. So once the user inputs their name or whatever they feel like putting, whatever we decide the program will be, the console write line is going to user input, and then it's going to return input because it's a string. So since we already created an instance of program, all we have to do is program dot get input, right? But it's like, what are you doing here? What's the purpose of this, of just calling that, right? We're not gonna, why did I comment this? We're not gonna run this program yet. So let me cut this and I'll explain. So now we're gonna write simple program console dot write who are you? All right. So the console is going to print out who are you. So now you have to get user input, right? So before you would have to say string input equals console.readLine, you'd have to type that, but we're doing that in this method. So now we can do string my input equals there. So in this console application, we're going to put console.write who are you. So instead of writing string my input equals console.readLine and then console.writeLine, we're simply just going to call the method get input, which returns a string. And we all know that a read line from console returns a string. So let's execute this. Who are you? Appavelli. You are Appavelli. Simple. It's that simple doing methods. It's a lot easier when you write. The more you learn programming, you'll learn that using methods is a lot easier. Using classes as well. We'll get into classes maybe the next episode or the episode after. I'm not sure yet, but we'll get there. Once we get into object-oriented programming, object-oriented concepts, I'll talk more about classes so you can get a better understanding. So that's it for this episode, tutorial podcast. I might just start calling this a tutorial podcast. We learned about methods, non-methods, static methods. You can play around with this. Look at this code. It will be available on GitHub if you're not already looking at this code. You can follow along on YouTube, or if you're just listening, you can just look at the code on GitHub and hear me talk about code, hear me talk about the code, and hear me go over the mistakes that I made during this podcast, tutorial podcast. It happens. But that's okay. We make mistakes all the time coding, so this happens to me almost every day where my keyboard might not want to function properly, where I'll type and it just does what is not, it just acts weird. So that's it for the podcast. Now you can follow me on Twitter at Apavelli. You can follow on Instagram at Apavelli Podcast. You can follow on Facebook at Apavelli Podcast, at Pragmatic Dev Solutions. You can follow me on Instagram at Pragmatic Dev _solutions. And then, like I said, you can follow the podcast on Instagram at Apavelli Podcast. You can also subscribe on YouTube, Wired In with Apavelli Podcast on YouTube. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, wherever podcasts are available. You should be able to access this podcast. So, I will put all the information in the show notes. And that's it. It's been a ride. It's been great getting wired in on this episode with you guys and gals. So, until next time, let's get wired in and stay wired in. I'm out.